Right. So the title is Protection Racket with Legitimacy. Why are there states and laws? So this is the big question for this evening. Should have been a question mark there. No, why there are states and laws. Um, so if you think about what's been going on at the moment, we've got the government who have just released you from your fire break in Wales, I believe, and a government in England that has just put us under lockdown. So it's not an unreasonable question to ask, well, where does this state come from? This authority that is able to tell us you can or can't leave your home, you can or can't meet in groups of six or more, you can or can't go to the pub. And where on earth did this come from? If we go back into the mists of time and we try and work out what's the origin story of the state, of this centralized authority that's able to control so much of our lives. But before we get into the origin story, why don't we have a think about where the state is and how much it actually controls you? How much of independence do you have from what the government does? And we're talking already about your curriculum, your school curriculum, which is set by the Welsh government. So what you study at school is determined by the state. There's also loads of other aspects of the state around you. So give yourself a couple of seconds and just look in your immediate vicinity right now and have a think about what evidence you can see of the state, of central authority in your immediate vicinity. Can you see any evidence of the state around you? I bet you can. Can you hear it? Can you smell it? Can you feel it? I mean, this may sound slightly odd, but practically all of our senses are somehow capable of detecting the state, I would have thought. So let me give you an example. Oh, no, hang on. This is a plug socket in my wall. I haven't filled it in very well, but you can still see what it is. Now, what evidence of the state do we have here? Well, for a start, it's 3-pin, which is a safety feature of British plugs that has been imposed by state regulation. So all electrical appliances have to have an earth, live, and a neutral wire. That's not true of all countries, as you're probably aware if you've been anywhere and traveled and had to change the plugs. There's a safety switch as well. You can even see the letters on that, and that hints to language. Language is regulated. You're told what's correct and incorrect language. You're told what spellings are correct and incorrect as part of a national curriculum. So even the way you use your words is regulated by the state. The lead or lack of lead content of the paint around the plug socket is regulated by the state. I mean, even the computer you're looking at right now will have loads and loads of specific laws and regulations that will have been laid down by accretion of years of regulations from a state. And what about hearing the state? Well, some of you may be able to hear sirens or cars beeping their horns. I mean, the very fact that you can hear cars that are driving under a specific velocity, that's all state regulated. Can you smell the state if you've got gas central heating or gas cookers, that gas has been given an artificial smell because otherwise it's completely odorless, and that's entirely because of state power. Can you feel the state? Sometimes, if you're walking down the street and you ever feel the bubbles on the pavement next to where you're able to cross, that's for people with visual impairments. I mean, the point is that the state is everywhere. I mean, it might even be an easier question to ask, where does the state end? Where do you have absolute autonomy to do whatever you like? You can't even in this country just walk completely naked down the center of the street because you'll be arrested. So there's all sorts of infringements on your liberty because of the state. And that's something that political scientists talk about all the time, because the state is a source of power, and power is what we talk about in politics. And historians look at where it all came from. Now, it's useful to not only think about where you can see the state, but what even is a state. And there's there's several famous definitions of it, but as ever, you've got to think about these things for yourself. Part of the reason for doing these sorts of lectures is not to just tell you what to think, but to encourage you to think. So for goodness sake, don't just take these standard definitions and own them yourself. Create your own definitions. Obviously, think about what other people have said, but then use that as a launch pad, not as the finishing destination. Anyway, first and very famously came from Max Weber, who is a German sociologist, and he said in the 19th century that the state is a monopoly on the legitimate use of force in a given territory. So the monopoly, so it has the overarching. It has the dominant amount of power, force within a specific territory. And that territory is recognized not only by the people within that territory, but often by the people outside of it as well. So the United Kingdom has a state. It's located centrally in London, and it's devolved certain powers to Cardiff, Belfast, and Edinburgh. It has the monopoly on legitimate force. So the military force, the police forces, the emergency services, they are legitimate because we accept them as legitimate, and they monopolize all violence and force within these islands. And other countries around the world recognize these islands as having some form of sovereignty, although that's obviously contestable with Brexit coming up. Okay, so in short, the state is kind of the biggest, baddest bully in the playground. So one of Max Weber's things to focus on is that the state is synonymous with violence, with power, with force, with domination. And this is the point where some anarchists would start to say, God, this is terrible. Why do we live under these circumstances? Why do we acknowledge the legitimacy of a violent, dominant force? I'll leave that entirely up to you. I'm not an anarchist, but I do think it's an interesting way to think that it's fundamentally wrong to be put upon by this very powerful entity that constantly tells you what to do. But for others, other theorists, and this is going even further back in history, people like Thomas Hobbes or Jean-Jacques Rousseau, they would be more inclined to actually say, well, it's not just, like a big parent or a big bully telling you what to do all the time. The state is a contract that you enter into as a citizen. So you want the state because without it, you'd be capable of almost nothing. The state empowers you. If you were on your own, living with complete liberty, ironically, although you, in theory, be able to determine all of your actions, you'd be able to achieve next to nothing. So there's this sort of slight paradox where to be absolutely free and at liberty is one of the most constraining situations you could possibly be in. And so for people like Thomas Hobbes, they would say you enter into a social contract. It's not a literal contract. You're not signing something to say, oh, yeah, I agree to give up a little bit of my liberty so the state can tell me what to do until I die. It's a metaphorical contract. But it gives you some sort of sense that it's a two-way street. It's not just the state constantly dominating you, but you're sort of tacitly saying, yeah, all right, I accept that I'll come under the auspices of your power because it's in my interests to do so. Okay. Now, a particularly cynical rendering comes from Charles Tilley. And I think this is delightful just because it's so savage. He describes the state as a protection racket with legitimacy. So in short, the state is just a mafia organization. I mean, not literally, but it has all of the elements of organized crime. It's no better than a mafia outfit in, say, Sicily. And what he means by that is that, if you think about what mafia do, they control territory, they control it through utter violence. They have regulations whereby people have to behave according to certain strict rules. And if you break those rules, you'll be punished for it. And of course, they will offer you protection from other violent forces, but the payment for that protection is extremely expensive. And for Charles Tilley, the state is precisely the same. You pay your taxes, they shake you down, the state promises you protection, but ultimately it's completely exploitative. So I don't know what you think about that. It's a very controversial claim, but these are good things to think about, just to sort of not just constantly think of the state as a positive thing, but also think about what people say who don't like it so much. Does anyone have any thoughts on that? I don't want to just dominate the discussion, but do any of you have a view on this? Any anarchists in the house? Okay, no worries. So I'll just carry on. So here are the police. And, of course, in some cases, we saw over the summer in America with the Black Lives Matter movement, the perceived legitimacy of the state is very shaky in some places because the state doesn't seem to want to protect certain of its citizens and is not impartial, and in some cases is far from being just either. So this is a really live question. This isn't just a sort of historic question about where do states come from, but what do states mean for us today? this thing that constantly tells us you've got to go into lockdown, you come out of lockdown, you do this, you do that, you do the other. Is it legitimate? Does it have a right to tell us what to do? Maybe it's completely flawed. Maybe we should do something about it. Okay, so let's get into the history a bit more. So how are there states? Where did these things come from? How did we go from a situation where human beings were hunter-gatherers to now where we have lockdowns? I mean, it seems an extraordinary journey that we went from being this species that roamed around looking for berries and occasional bits of meat to now where we have a blonde-haired man who's able to control so much of our life. How did we get from one to the other extreme? Well, there are loads of great theories, and the beauty is that no one's entirely sure. So there's no single agreed upon narrative, and that's basically history in a nutshell. History is a fight over narratives, a fight over stories. Which story makes the most sense? Which story has the most evidence? No one has the definitive story because there is no access to the definitive story. So we all have to try and work out amongst ourselves which story is the most plausible. And there's lots of very plausible stories. So you are going to have to work out for yourself which you think makes the most sense. Well, let's start off with a sort of economistic argument to do with what's sometimes called material matters. So material matters isn't just literal, cloth and fabric, but material is usually what economists refer to as stuff to do with money, stuff to do with resources. And resources are an important way to think about the origins of states because we need resources in order to survive as a species. So at its most basic, we need food and we need shelter. Without those two basic physiological requirements, we don't last a week or more. So those are the most basic material requirements of living. But then beyond that, as human beings, just as with other animals, we seek out other resources that can enhance our lives. So we go beyond the basic physiological requirements to more elaborate needs, quote unquote. Okay. But one of the parts of the human condition is a fight over scarce resources. There simply is not enough to go around. And so we try and find those resources and we try and work out a way of keeping them and a way of sharing them as efficiently as possible. And the state has something to do with that. Now, Thomas Hobbes, a political philosopher, comes back into the picture. And he suggested that the reason that we defer to a very powerful central state authority, what he called a leviathan, because it's so enormous, it's so powerful, is because without it, there would be anarchy, and anarchy would be horrifying. So for him, the state of nature, which is the way you would live without a state, without an organized authority, would be nasty, brutish, and short. Basically, everyone would fight over resources all the time. We'd slit our neighbor's throat in order just to get some fresh water or to get some food. It would be horrifying, and it would be terribly inefficient. And so for him, the best solution is to form a state. But he's kind of skipped out a few stages, because how did we get to a position where human beings ever sort of congregated around specific resources in the first place? Well, that goes back to the dawn of agriculture and the exploitation of particular crops in order to increase the energy density that human beings could exploit. So things like yams in West Africa, rice in East Asia, wheat in certain parts of the Eurasian steppe plateau were exploited at, interestingly, at roughly the same time, even though those human beings weren't communicating with each other, and led to the birth of agriculture. Prior to that, human beings were just hunter-gatherers. They were roaming all over the place. But it was realized that certain crops could be exploited and could allow human beings to stay in a single place. They wouldn't need to keep roaming around. They wouldn't need to keep changing environments. They could stay in a single place. They could exploit the same sort of crops year in, year out. And that meant that they could be more stationary. And as they became more stationary, lots more human beings came and lived with them. And you started to get settlements beyond just a singular family and tribe to much bigger multi-family, multi-tribal units, which we would later call eventually cities. So cities are dependent on agriculture. And the very earliest cities in human civilization pop up around the Fertile Crescent between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what's called Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia literally means between two rivers, and in modern day Iraq is where it's situated. So cities like Uruk, which is where the name of Iraq comes from, popped up around this time, sort of talking about 10,000 or so years ago. And they did so because human beings were able to exploit certain crops and didn't have to keep hunting and gathering, and therefore could agglomerate in particular parts of the world. And from that situation, they developed quickly into what we would recognize as a rudimentary bureaucracy, which is the fundamentals of a state. A state is a sort of a hierarchy of people who have a command and control set of tasks. The reason that that developed is because once you've got some small settlements, they start fighting with other nearby settlements. And so, again, in the words of Charles Tilly, wars make states and states make wars. What happens is that once you've got these little sort of pockets of population density, they start growing and growing and growing, and they start sort of coming into conflict with each other because they're quite close to each other. And they then fight over various resources. And the best way to fight and win is to organize. And so in order to get the best stuff, you fight, you organize, you get more organized, you fight more, you fight, organize, fight. And there's this feedback loop between wars and state building, such that the reason that we've now got Boris Johnson telling me I can't leave the house is because our ancestors, tens of thousands of years ago, kept bickering over resources. That's the theory anyway. A particular case study of this is Jerusalem. So Jerusalem is an extremely old city, and it can sometimes be a bit of a mystery as to why people have fought over it so much. Now, of course, in recent times, and by recent times, I mean like the last 4,000 years, it's been fought over for religious and ideological reasons. The three main Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, have fought over the significance of the city to their respective religions. And each of those religions have a big stake in the city of Jerusalem. But why did it even get settled in the first place? Well, the reason for that is because Jerusalem has one of the best and most reliable sources of water in that part of the desert in the Middle East. So it had a vital resource essential to life that people wanted to control. And in order to control it, they had to occupy it. And other civilizations around, like the Assyrians, like the Judeans, like the Romans ultimately, also wanted access to that water resource and also its strategic significance in that section of the Middle East. So Jerusalem has like a double advantage. It's got great resources and it's got great strategic significance. And so various different settlements and civilizations fought over Jerusalem to try and occupy it and control it. And then once they had taken control of it, they overlaid their occupation with this sort of grand narrative of religion, of identity, of ideology to try and cement their claim. So once they've got control of the city, they then say, oh, well, we've got this because God told us to get it. Now, I'm not trying to be too cynical about religions. And if any of you are religious, that's utterly your choice and completely fine. So please don't take me as being too flippant here. But there is an historic narrative that suggests that the stories about religion are in part derivative of this fight over material resources. Okay, so I think Jerusalem is a really fascinating example. Now, we're still sort of romping through history a lot here, but when we get to modern states, those states that have particularly diversified functions, that in other words, they can do an awful lot, we need to move further forward in time to about the Middle Ages. And credit is sometimes given to Venice and England as establishing rules of law before anywhere else in the world. Now, a rule of law is where you have a state that not only utilizes force, but that force is always dependent on laws. So you can't act as a leader, a ruler of a state, without legal authority to do so. And if you break the law, then your act is null and you can't go on with it. I don't know if you remember, but a year ago, Boris Johnson tried to prorogue Parliament. He tried to shut it down for 6 weeks. But it was found that his act was unlawful, and so he couldn't do it. So even though he has the authority of the Queen, he wasn't allowed to break the law, because no one is allowed to break the law under a rule of law system. Okay. Now, the rule of law is one of the most important innovations in statecraft of the last, 1,000 years easily. And it begs the question, why? Why would rulers who have this enormous authority, who have access and control over crucial resources, why on earth would they want to subject themselves to a rule of law? And again, the answer is because, well, according to some theories, it's vastly more efficient and it's much more effective if you want to exploit even more resources. So one thing that rulers always want is more stuff. And a rule of law is an extremely good way of getting more stuff. Because for one thing, it massively increases your capacity to trade. And that's why Venice and England are often associated with it. So here in Venice is an image of the Bridge of Sighs, so called because it connects a court to a jail on either side of the canal there. And here is the Bridge of Sighs in Oxford, which is a sort of a copy of that bridge. Now, Venice and England developed rules of law because they were maritime trading powers. And so they had to do lots and lots of trades, sometimes over years of time. Now, you can only do elaborate trades if the people who partake in the trade can trust each other. If you sign a contract with someone, but they're stronger than you are, what's to stop them just walking away and saying, screw you, I've got your money. What are you going to do about it? Well, the rule of law is the answer. Courts able to enforce contracts is crucial. And these two countries at about the same time in the sort of 1400s realized that if they wanted to exploit more resources through trade more efficiently and faster, they needed rules of law. And the monarchs in those areas came to realize it. Some of them realized it through enlightenment, but most of them realized it because they lost battles. And certainly that's the case in England. So certain, monarchical, despotic kings like King John in England were basically told, I'm sorry, mate, but you've run out of power. We barons are going to force you to seal Magna Carta and you're going to have to restrain yourself. And the origins of the rule of law are often credited to that step forward. But a lot of that is derived from trading incentives. And the fact that barons even got rich in the first place is important to note. Okay, so money and stuff is a huge part of the explanation of why states emerged, especially emerging from the very dawning of agriculture through to the development of civilizations, through to fighting over key resources, through to the development of complex bureaucracies. A lot of the story you can see is because of fighting over stuff, which might seem slightly depressing. We sort of think of the state as this wondrous achievement of human civilization. But the irony is that civilization is always on the back of death and extraordinary numbers of murders. Sorry, that's a terrible sort of thing to say, but it's kind of true. The history of states is very, very bloody. Anyway, what about some other arguments? What about sociology? Now, sociology is a big old beast to deal with. It can cover all sorts of things. But let's talk about sort of, in particular, the relationship between societies and geography. Because geography says a lot about the way states develop. I mean, why did Venice and England have particularly strong maritime trading traditions? Well, in part because they had to, right? That their access to the sea was their relative advantage. And so they had to exploit it. Otherwise, it would have just been foolish. But that was just sheer blind luck. It was nothing to do with the character of the English or the Venetians that made them better suited to it. They were just in a better territory to exploit it. And so geography and sociology have this really interesting connection to each other. And one of the questions that people often ask is, well, why are states more, quote unquote, developed in some parts of the world and lesser developed in others? So, for example, it may be that we look at, say, the continent of Africa or certain parts of Asia, and we note that some of those countries are less rich and have far less developed state infrastructures than, say, in Britain. And so that begs the question, why? Well, one thing that you must immediately discount is that there's any difference between the human beings. There is zero evidence for that. Human beings in genetic terms are practically identical. We are so close in our genomes across the entire globe that it beggars belief. There is a species of chimpanzee in Africa that are the same species, and there are two different troops of the same type of chimpanzee on either side of a river, and those two troops are more genetically diverse than all the human beings that have ever existed. Human beings have an extraordinarily narrow genetic range. So this is one of the rare arguments in history that we can discount without any difficulty, which is that humans are somehow different. Now, of course, that was a dominant argument of, frankly, racists and fascists in the past. In the 20th century, in the 19th century, they would say, oh, the reason that Europe is developed is because the white man is superior to the black man, for example. But that's nonsense, and you must discount it because it's embarrassing if anyone even tries to bring it up these days. There is zero evidence, and there's, of course, no reason for it either. So we can discount the sort of genetic argument, and therefore that begs other questions about, well, why nonetheless is Africa poorer than Europe? Well, a lot of it comes down to population density and the things that spur parts of the world to become richer than others in the first place. And population density has a huge amount to tell us about this story. Basically, when you see the development of states in places like Europe, it's because there are incentives for human beings to agglomerate in small, densely packed places. And they would do so because the resources are far scarcer, and you need to cram together in order to make sure that you get enough to survive. Putting it bluntly, Europe is a tougher place to live, at least in sort of, in terms of the survival of early humans than Africa it was. In Africa, you can sustain a much less densely populated civilization because it's in some places the resources are far more abundant. Okay, and so there's just no incentive to cram into these densely packed areas and to fight with neighbors over scarce resources because there aren't scarce resources. Now, obviously today that looks a bit odd because, of course, in some parts of Africa now there's extraordinary scarcity of certain resources and extreme poverty. So we're talking about sort of we're talking about thousands of years ago. Relatively speaking, Europe was a much harsher climate than Africa for the sort of activities that humans were engaged in those days. So I can give you a little bit of an example that's a bit perhaps closer to your recognition, which is the USA. And this is relevant to what happened last week in the election. Why do southern states like this one, Virginia, and northern states like Massachusetts, here represented by the first ever president to come out of Massachusetts, John Adams, why do they have such different political traditions, different political cultures? And this is a really interesting question. So, why were there the sort of so-called deep South states so vehemently opposed to notions of socialism or liberalism or progressive politics, whereas in the North, that comes much more easily to them? Well, population density, again, is a crucial part of this story. When settlers founded the Commonwealth of Virginia and of Massachusetts back in the 17th century, the simple point was that Massachusetts was a much tougher place to live in than Virginia. Virginia has this amazing river tributary network, meaning that there's fresh water available in lots of parts of the state, extremely fertile ground. It's basically easy to start a farm and to survive without needing the help of your community. So you could have independent families setting up farms and doing absolutely fine. They wouldn't need anyone else's help. And therefore, if anyone else came to see them, they would probably be trying to take something away from them. So this has sort of instilled a degree of hostility to outsiders and certainly to the state, who, if the state is getting involved in their business, they're doing so to tax them, to take away their stuff that they work for. In Massachusetts, it's much rougher climate, and it's much harder to survive without getting on with your society, without communal living. This is perhaps typified most by the Thanksgiving celebrations in America. Every November in America, they celebrate the first winter that the settlers of the Mayflower survived because Native Americans gave them food, in particular turkey, to help them survive. And this tells you is sort of an important story about survival in the north of America. It's a harsh climate, extremely cold winters, very hot summers. It's much harder to maintain agriculture and crops in those sorts of environments. And so you have to get along with people. So very quickly, you saw these population centers like Boston, like Philadelphia, developing in the northeast of America. And in the south, it took much longer for anything like that to develop because there just wasn't the incentive to do so. It's not because the people in Massachusetts were somehow more brilliant or more enlightened or better people. They were just human beings, and human beings are the same wherever you get human beings. So the difference was just the incentives to densely populate. And that has, to a certain extent, drifted down the ages to the present day, albeit the example of Virginia doesn't work so much because Virginia has changed these days to becoming a much more progressive state because it's becoming more densely populated. Okay, so again, the geopolitics and the sociology affect the way we think and affect what we view as the importance of a state. Now, I've particularly focused here on Monticello, which is the home of the third US president, Thomas Jefferson. And here's an image of John Adams, who was the second US president. Now, these two men both signed the Declaration of Independence. In fact, Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. John Adams signed it. They were initially friends during the American Revolutionary War, but they then fell out big time over the early direction of the Republic. Specifically, John Adams was much more interested in a strong centralized state because that was his heritage, that was his background. He was from Boston, Massachusetts, and he thought that you needed to have this sort of communal living because that was the way God intended and that was the way that you survive. Thomas Jefferson thought that God intended for people to hold up farms and live on their own and not have the state involved in their business. And both of them have at their heart the origins of the party fight that we still see in America to this day. Strangely and purely coincidentally, both men died precisely 50 years after the Declaration of Independence, on the 4th of July, 1826. Quite astonishing. So on Independence Day, 50 years after they both signed it, they both snuffed it. And John Adams' last words were, "Jefferson lives," basically saying, "Oh, that bugger who I've been bickering with for years has outlived me." Actually, he was wrong. John Adams just outlived Jefferson by a matter of hours. Anyway, that's just that's sort of a silly story. Now, what about culture? So we've been speaking about how material, so resources and the incentives that are created by resources, change the dynamics of states and even encourage states to develop. We've then talked about specifically how geopolitics affects the population densities in particular parts of the world. But then culture, we already mentioned in the case study of Jerusalem, culture then becomes very important. So the stories that people tell themselves, the languages they use, the history, the sense of identity becomes incredibly important to help people tell these narratives about the origins of their people, their kin, their land. So culture is also something that we can't discount too easily. But I would say it is all derivative of material and geopolitical forces. That's not to say that culture is unimportant, but it's not the origin story. It's the aftermath. It's the icing on the cake, if you like, but it's not the cake itself. And there are various different sort of cultural differences you'll find around the world. There's things like plutocracy, which is the rule of the rich or the wealthy. In many countries, because of the dominance of capitalism, it's considered that the wealthy are better than the poor, although many of us who can look carefully into the origins of wealth realize that most people who are wealthy are just lucky. And so allowing them to rule because of their luck seems a little bit silly, but there you go. In some countries, that's what they believe. There's also theocracy, which is rule of religious leaders. So that is particularly clearly in evidence in Iran, where the Ayatollah is a religious leader and is also the temporal leader of the country as well. It's also technically the case of the UK. So the Queen is the head of state, but she's also the head of the Church of England. And there are clerics, religious leaders, bishops in the House of Lords. So the UK is technically a theocracy, although I think it would be fair to say that it's more a nominal theocracy than a real theocracy. There's also what's called gerontocracy, which is the rule of the very elderly. And I think Joe Biden's election is perhaps evidence of a bit of that in America. And then kakistocracy, which is the rule of the worst types of people. I'll leave it up to you whether you think that politicians tend to be the worst of us. Certainly a Greek philosopher called Plato argued very strongly that the sort of person that wants power the most is the sort of person that deserves it the least. And so he said that the institutions of politics will always deliver the rule of the worst. It's inevitable. He's onto something, I think, but it's maybe a little bit strong. Anyway, a really clear comparison where you can look at the importance of culture is North and South Korea, because of course Korea was a single country up until the Korean War in the 1950s, and then split. And so Korea is this delightful sort of case study where you can see a single part of the world that had pretty similar geopolitical forces, pretty similar material and other forces that created the Korean state. But then it split, and that's when culture set in. The North, and this is an image of the North in Pyongyang, focused on what was initially a socialist ideology. It's called Juche, but it has now progressed into much more fascist territory. So these days, the North Korean ideology is far more associated with kin and the people, and it's much closer to fascism than communism. But nonetheless, ideology is everything to understanding North Korean statecraft. In South Korea, they've adopted modern capitalism and liberal democratic forms. And so it's like looking at two countries on different sides of the world, except they're actually neighbors. And Seoul is less than 100 miles from the North Korean border, hence why it's so vulnerable. And that's why the North Koreans train all of their rockets at Seoul. But anyway, there we go. So culture clearly matters, but it probably matters after states have formed in the first place, I would say. Now, why do states differ so much today? Well, we've already talked about some of the key determinants. So resources, population densities, culture, these things all matter. You can get into the weeds of a few more specific details if you want to find out, because obviously there's lots and lots of variables, lots of factors at work. So you can really sort of start to chop them up and see what you think might be important. I mean, things like location and connections between countries is clearly significant. Britain is very well placed geopolitically as an island. It's very, very handy to be an island. If you're connected to a mainland, then you're much more vulnerable to attack. So having a moat around it has been historically of huge value to the United Kingdom. But nonetheless, we are close enough to continental Europe to maintain reasonably close relations with them. We also have great connections to North America as a result of being on that side of the Atlantic. I mean, did you know, for example, that New York City is closer to London than it is to San Francisco? So, we are really close to certain parts of the financial centers of the US as well. So location really matters, but that's just a product of blind luck. That's obviously nothing to do with the character of the British. There are certain resources. We've already mentioned that resources matter, but you can really start to chop out what type of resources. You can get into the weeds of what specific resources make a difference in terms of state development and wealth. You're probably aware of, for example, oil and the impact that oil can have on a state's development. Sometimes called the resource curse is when a country has too much oil and then it's got no incentive to diversify its economy. And also, the only thing that matters is who owns the oil fields. And of course, oil fields don't move around. So it's basically whoever's got the biggest army controls the oil fields. So places like Venezuela, which has the world's largest oil reserves, and Saudi Arabia, which has the second largest oil reserves, have desperately corrupt and dangerous political systems because of the oil. People will keep queuing around the block for the world's most traded commodity. So there's no incentive for the regimes in those countries to diversify their economies, to reform their political institutions, because they've got oil. I mean, it's a sad story, but it's entirely the case that oil destroys political systems. The only examples where this hasn't been the case is where oil was discovered after those political systems had been well established. So in Norway, for example, Scotland didn't become some sort of tear-away despotic regime when they discovered North Sea oil, because the Scottish state was already well established. Anyway, of course, another resource that we've already mentioned is water. And water, of course, is everything. It was famously stated that World War III will be fought over water. And I think there's a lot to that, and we're already seeing it. The Ethiopian government, for example, is building an enormous dam on part of the Nile, the Blue Nile, I think. And this is going to mean that the countries downstream in the Nile, so South Sudan, Sudan, and Egypt in particular, will have less water as a result. And they are hopping mad with the Ethiopians, who are doing this for energy conservation reasons. To make a hydroelectric power plant. but they're also going to deny water. So there is going to be a hell of a fight over the water from the Nile in the future. So, watch that space. Also, you might have wondered, why do the Chinese fight for Tibet so ferociously? Very few people relative to the rest of China actually live in Tibet. It's an extremely inhospitable plateau. You can't even fly over it. It's so dangerous because planes just can't deal with the altitude. So what on earth does China want with Tibet? The answer is water. The vast majority of the water that's drunk by the over 1 billion Chinese people at its source comes from Tibet. So whichever country controls Tibet controls China's water. And that's why it has to be China. Because they cannot have another state controlling their water supply. Imagine how dangerous that would be if you could turn off the taps for China. So water is a crucial resource that people will, of course, kill for. Of course they will. So that's another thing to think about. Now, I've put zebras as well because there's this fantastic book by a guy called Jared Diamond, where he talks about the significance of all these specific resources. And one of the interesting ones is zebras. Now, what's the difference between a horse and a zebra, apart from how they look? Well, they are, in fact, very different. They may look relatively similar in terms of their body shape, and they share some common ancestors. But in terms of the way they organize themselves, they are very different. Horses specifically are a bit like a pack animal. So they're a bit like dogs or wolves. And they have an alpha called a Mustang. And if you break the Mustang, you get the rest of the herd of horses to come with you. Zebras don't organize like that. Zebras will herd together, but that's just for their own collective security. But if you manage to find you couldn't find a dominant zebra. They don't exist. But if you did, say, manage to just sort of swipe off one zebra, the rest of the zebras would just bugger off. They wouldn't stick around. So that makes zebras much harder to domesticate. You can domesticate individual zebras, but what you can't do is domesticate huge herds of zebra all at once. And that's why zebras never became the battle animals. They never became the agricultural tools that horses became. You never saw sort of huge armies of African soldiers on the backs of zebras and rhinos because you couldn't domesticate those animals. So again, just through sheer luck, the Asians, the Europeans had the better zoological technology. They had domesticated horses and pigs and chickens and cows. And all of these things helped Europe and Asia develop far quicker because you get much more energy density from the meats of those animals, but you can also use them for battle and you can therefore exploit more resources, and it becomes in that feedback loop. And Africa just does not have the same sort of animals that can be exploited in a similar way. And it's a very similar story to the Americas. Why, when the Europeans came across the Atlantic with Christopher Columbus and all of the rest of it, and they discovered America, they realized that there's just lots of mostly isolated Native American tribes. There were a few large civilizations like the Maya, the Inca, and the Aztecs, but their population densities were way lower than anything that was in existence in Europe. Their degree of technological development was vastly behind as well. And similar to the Africans, the Native Americans did not have the same sort of animals that they could exploit. I mean, imagine trying to domesticate loads of llamas or bison. If you try putting a plow over a bison's neck, he's going to tear your face off. So, just through sheer luck, Europe and Asia had the right animals. I mean, by right, obviously that assumes somehow it's better to develop your state infrastructure quickly. But as we've discussed, that led to all sorts of problems as well. Okay. And another interesting crop to think about is rice. Now, practically every crop that human beings started exploiting in our earliest time, moving from being hunter-gatherers to being agriculturalists, was a grass of some description. So wheat, millet, barley, rice, they are all species of grass. And rice is a particularly fascinating one because it has a double yield. In other words, every year you can get 2 harvests of rice. And that, of course, means that you get the double energy potential for each crop of rice that you would do for a crop of, say, wheat. And that's why India and China have much larger populations than anywhere else in the world because they had rice, and therefore their populations grew vastly over the period of the last 2,000, 3,000 years. So sometimes, you might have wondered, well, why on earth is China so vastly populated? Why is India one of the biggest countries in the world? The answer is basically rice. Okay, so conclusions. Do you live in a strong state? Now, we've been talking about where states come from and why certain resources might matter and why geopolitics matters and all of this sort of stuff. What we haven't spoken about is state strength. How can you evaluate the relative strength of a state? Well, you could look at its sort of military capacity, in which case the UK is pretty high up there because as a proportion of our GDP, we spend a lot on defense. We also are one of few countries that have a nuclear deterrent. So I guess in that sense, you could say that the UK is a strong state. But obviously, you probably want to have a more nuanced idea of what strength means. Strength doesn't just mean your capacity to project power. It also means your capacity to exploit power within your territory. And so, of course, one of the key concerns about the British state is that it's fragmenting, that the relations between England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland are crumbling. And therefore, there's a sort of internal rot in the British state, which will undermine its lasting strength potential. So the strength is not just a question about how much force you can project, but how much force you can maintain and how durable and sustainable your power is. So, that's something interesting to think about. I mean, maybe you could talk about, is Wales a strong state? Well, Wales has an exceptionally strong identity, and it's maintained a language and independent culture from England, despite undergoing the same sort of pressures that Scotland and Ireland underwent to try and get rid of their native languages. So that's an extraordinary achievement. Wales, I think, has an exceptionally strong identity as well, but it's a very positive identity. It's not a negative identity. It's not we are Welsh and we therefore hate people who are not Welsh. It's we are Welsh. We're very proud of that. We've got these unique elements of our culture, but we're also able to get along with other people. That, to my mind, that sort of shared identity is an extraordinary source of potential strength. And as an Englishman, I struggle to identify with England. I find it really confusing. I'm not trying to be some sort of mad liberal snowflake or something here, but English nationalism is a broken force because it's so closely associated with racism. So it's very difficult to understand what it means to be English. And that, I would argue, is a fundamental weakness of England. Despite our numerical strength, England is, in population terms, vastly bigger than any other part of the UK. It's got some extraordinary weaknesses within it as well. And we're seeing this work out with the north of England getting basically persistently fed up with the south of England. Okay, so are we better off, do you think, without this protection racket? So you remember I said at the start that some political scientists look on the state as this sort of mafia clan. It sort of shakes you down. They promise you protection, but at a high cost of taxation. Are you tempted to anarchism? Do you think we could be better off without all of this business? Or are you more inclined to say, well, I've entered into this social contract with the state because it's for my own good? Yeah, sure. It might seem tempting to want to go it alone and not have any state regulation, but that would be chimerical freedom. You would have freedom in a sense, but you would be utterly constrained. So it would be this sort of ironic paradox that you could achieve nothing. And what is the future of the state? If you look into your crystal ball and look into sort of 100 years hence, what do you think states will look like then? We're certainly fighting with each other much less. So if states make wars and wars make states, is it possible that some state functions will start to just crumble away because they're not needed? There's not so much of a call for very well-organized hierarchical bureaucracies. Well, you could say that we're fighting with other threats like the coronavirus pandemic, like climate change. So it could be that the war is not so much with other countries, but with other threats to our security, which could maintain the rationale for very hierarchical, very well-organized bureaucracies. So I suspect, at least for the immediate term, the reason for keeping a state will be pretty close to mind. But if you go another sort of 1,000 years after that, what then? I mean, no one really knows, but There's all sorts of talks about creation of a market state, something that's much more oriented towards trade and less oriented towards identity. That was certainly one of the visions of the European Union, would be that it would be this market entity, that it wouldn't matter so much which country you were from. What would matter was what goods you have to offer to sell at the market. Now, of course, Brexit has put that into some doubt, but who knows? I mean, I can't see the EU disappearing anytime soon, and it could end up becoming far stronger. Anyway, here is, that the image at the bottom is of a potential redesign of the Union flag, which is quite striking. It includes the cross of St. David, the black and yellow, which of course is currently absent from the Union Jack. And so one way to think about how we could strengthen our state is to strengthen our ties, the ties that bind us, strengthen our shared identity, try and work out what it means to be British, and try and sort of think more about the internal strength and less about how rich the UK is or how much external strength it potentially has. Anyway, I will leave those up to you to think about.